So hi everyone, my name is Laura Albast. I'm Palestinian. I currently work in communications with the Research Institute in Washington, DC. And I'm going to talk to you today about the male belly dancer in the Middle East, a little bit in Central Asia. So what I looked at basically, and why I chose this is because I'm a belly dance enthusiast. I've been doing it for almost 3 years, but I don't know anything about the history. I don't know anything about where it came from. I just know that my mom does it in the house and that's it. And so during one of the workshops with afikra, someone actually asked me, do the men dance? Do you know anything about men dancing? And I said, I don't know, actually. I thought that dancing came from women, not from men. So it was suggested to me to read this article, which is The Male Dancer in the Middle East and Central Asia by Anthony Shay. Anthony Shay, he is an American performer, choreographer, and scholar. He's currently about 84 years old, and he's teaching in California theater and dance. And in his article, he makes 3 main arguments. He says that the perception of men dancing and that is a homosexual space is false. The fact that men are imitating women is also false, and that the space of belly dance specifically is not strictly associated with just as a female space. It's practiced by men and women. So in the article, he gives a lot of historical background. And I realized that actually it was more prominent that boys and men danced in the past than women. It was actually forbidden for women to be in public spaces dancing, and it was more preferred to have young boys ages 14 up to 25, as long as they don't grow beards and they look, they had this perception of beauty within a young boy, and they were extremely popular, and their audiences were male. But Anthony Shay writes that does not mean that there was any desire. Some men were, desired them, but some didn't, because a lot of these dancers largely led heterosexual lives. There was a dominance of young boys in the dance, and it was a majority of minority groups. So there was some Muslim dancers, but the majority were either Jews, Armenians, or Greek who lived in the region under the Ottoman Empire. And there was a lot of influence of French and British colonialism on the perception of homosexuality in male dancers. So what would happen in the past is that there's a lot of popularity of watching young men dance. Nobody talks about homosexuality in the Middle East because there's a sort of shame that's associated with it. But when the French came to the region, and when the British came to the region, they started writing about the things that they saw in Egypt or in Turkey. And they started associating anyone who looks feminine as someone who is homosexual. So the Middle Eastern elites started to feel this form of dishonor and shame. And that's why when you look at contemporary literature about men dancing or men in art spaces, you don't see a lot of what has been written in the past. In the past poetry, you would see someone describing a young boy who was beautiful. They describe his face, his movements. Today, you don't see, or at least in 2006, when this article was written, you don't see that as much. So there was a huge influence by colonialism on how men perceive their own sexuality and their own bodies. The other thing is that She says that they are not imitating women because the fact that they braid their hair or put some makeup or put on some clothes that are similar to what women wear does not mean that they are trying to be women. He made a clear distinction between drag and people who identify as women, and men who do this for a theatrical purpose to attract male audiences, because the dominant audience was a male audience. Women would watch from the sidelines or weren't even permitted to be present. And he writes about the Egyptian slang term, and if someone's Egyptian, if they can tell me how to say it properly, khawal. Today, it is a derogatory term used to men to basically accuse them of homosexuality or in a very disrespectful way. But in the past, that's what they called men who dance. That was their name. The same way you would call a woman a dancer or a ghazia or something like that, they would call men that. He also spoke about how in the West, they took belly dance as a vehicle for sexual liberation, versus in the Middle East, they considered it a space for cultural expression. So he made a distinction between how the West and feminist movements that rose in the 1970s saw belly dance versus how Middle Easterners, young men and women alike, saw it. This is a picture of Samia Gamal on the side to show sort of like how women became more prominent as dancers in the 19th century as the dance of young men declined because of shame and dishonor and the stigma that colonialists put on Middle Easterners. He also talks about post-colonial influence. So countries got their independence, and there was this need for these nations to sort of show the Europeans and the Americans that, look, we are a refined people, we have our own culture, and we're going to be forming our own identity. So Egypt wanted to bring back dance into the sphere for it to represent them, but they wanted to eliminate any sexual perceptions that are related to belly dance, whether it's for men or women. And he profiles Mahmoud Rida. And Mahmoud Rida is a very, very famous dancer, choreographer, performer in Egypt. He passed away last year, unfortunately. And what he did was he studied ballet when he was a kid. And his brother was a musician and a dancer, and he learned the dance from his brother. And he developed a new form of dance, which we know today as sha'bi or baladi, which is basically both men and women belly dance, but he erased any movements that might show up as provocative. So when men are dancing, it's just men dancing. It's not something that is sexual. And the same thing for women. And he sort of introduced this whole genre that today, even today, people in the West learn from. He has his own dance troupe in Egypt called the Mahmoud Rida dance troupe. And then Anthony Shay talked about modern day dancing. Again, this article was written in 2006. So maybe today we have more male dancers than then. But he talked about the diaspora specifically, how even the diaspora Arabs and Middle Easterners viewed dancing as something that is still shameful. So even though they would bring dancers over to their weddings, to celebrations that they had, they would prefer to have non-natives dance rather than natives, and they would prefer not to have men. And if they did have men, they would prefer a sha'bi dance, where it's fully closed, the movements are not provocative at all. And he talked about one incident where a Lebanese man in California, I believe in the US and California, went and danced at a wedding, and there was an uproar from the audience. They were so to them, they were so disgusted that a man was dancing, and it was a big deal. And it makes me reflect today that we look at dancers like Alexander in Lebanon, who's trying to reinvent the perception of male dancers, and the Egyptian Tito Saif, who dances sha'bi. So it's not something that it should be looked down upon. And I would just like to give you a couple of resources if you're interested, and note that, Anthony Shay mentions in his book that because of the colonialist perception, a lot of Middle Easterners sort of censored themselves from writing about belly dancing, male belly dancers or female belly dancers, which is why you don't find a lot of Arab scholars or Middle Eastern scholars who write about belly dance today. The majority of sources come from Americans or Europeans, which is why the majority of sources here are from Arabs and Europeans. But they're still interesting, so you should take a look at them, particularly the Habibi Middle Eastern Dance Journal. It's an archive that stopped in 2002. There's a book by Anthony Shay who discusses in detail the male belly dancer, and there isn't a lot about male belly dancers anyway. So it's really, really interesting to see how it was extremely prominent in the 15th century towards the 19th century, and then it completely declined. And then today we see men reclaim the space that was, in a way, initially theirs before it was for women. So that was it. So you can contact me. I'll share some resources with you. And thank you all for listening to me.